In today's video, we'll be going over not one, not two, but 7 workplace incidents, each absolutely horrifying in their own right. That being said, let's get to it. The following story will forever remain a testament to the unseen dangers lurking just below our feet. How completing a seemingly normal task can devolve to utter chaos within just a matter of seconds. This is the brutal story behind the Key Largo Manhole Incident. So back in January of 2017, a utility crew out of Key Largo had been tasked with inspecting a slight dip in a newly paved roadway. And the reason for this slight depression was believed to be associated with the storm drain, as it had occurred directly next to a manhole. Ultimately, they believed that there was some type of damage to the box below, in turn allowing the soil in the immediate area to wash away into that system every time it rained. So after their morning meeting, they hop up in their trucks and head on over to this quiet little neighborhood you're looking at right here. They hop on out and head on over to the manhole, but as soon as they pop that lid, they are hit with one of the most ungodliest smells they have ever come across. And these guys deal with sewage on a regular basis, so if it's making a few of them dry heave and puke, you know it's gotta be bad. Now their supervisor, a man by the name of Kirby Brown, knows that essentially somebody from his crew has to climb down into that box in order to perform a visual inspection. Therefore, he instructs his crew to do the following. First, they use a nearby fire hydrant to flush out any stagnant water that may be sitting in the system. Next, they open up the manholes either side of the one in question. Then, they force fresh air down into the shaft in order to remove any toxic gases. However, even after all this was done, Kirby, who is now standing just outside of this hole, tells his guys, look, something just ain't right here, guys. This smell ain't going anywhere. I don't feel comfortable sending one of you down here yet, okay? So let me go to my truck. I'm going to make a couple of calls. Nobody, and I mean nobody, goes down there without my permission. But that is not at all what would happen. You see, as soon as he turned around and began walking to his truck, one of his men, a guy by the name of Elway Gray, said, you know what? I'm not waiting around on all this crap. I'm going to go ahead and get the job done. We got other things to do. We're wasting time. And so it is. He began his descent 15 feet down to the very bottom of that structure. Now Kirby notices this, so he rushes back over to that opening, but before he can even yell down at Elway to get his ass out, to his horror, the color in Elway's eyes are completely gone. They have become bloodshot. He is giving it everything he has to try and get out, but he is coughing, he's gagging, he's throwing up on himself. Before he can make it, he lost consciousness, let go of the ladder, and fell right down onto the concrete below, slamming his head in the process. Now seeing his co-worker and lifelong friend in such a dire situation, a second worker, 49-year-old Lewis O'Keefe, without a moment of hesitation, descended into the manhole. He too would collapse. So now Kirby, who had moments earlier warned his men about entering that space, throws all logic out the window. He races down that ladder in an effort to at least lift their heads up above these deadly gases and hopefully get them some fresh air, but it was of no use. He too began to feel its toxic effects. He had no choice but to let them go and try and save himself. But before he could get back topside, he too passes out. Now luckily, one of the workers up top was able to grab a hold of his shirt, and with the help of a few other men, they were able to lift him out of the hole. Well, just when you think this situation cannot possibly get any worse, 2 additional workers would attempt to enter that hole, one of which immediately resurfaced after just a few feet. That same employee then spent the next few minutes stumbling around in circles trying to figure out where he was and just what the hell he was even doing, almost as if he had gone from sober to completely intoxicated within just a matter of seconds. And unfortunately, Ryan Wilson, the final employee to enter that confined space, would never return. Now they didn't know it yet, but a few locals had actually come outside when the initial commotion began. 911 had already been contacted, therefore Key Largo Fire Department was en route and already queued in as to what was going on. Within just a few minutes, they show up and are making an attempt to rescue those men. Now a firefighter who had previously had on a closed air breathing system, knowing they were probably dealing with a lethal gas situation, ended up having to remove it in order to gain access into that manhole. But as he approaches the bottom, he too goes down. Now luckily, this firefighter was attached to a vertical retrieval system. In turn, they were able to crank down on that handle and pull him to safety. It was at this point they were 100% sure they were dealing with lethal gases. So they begin the process of forcing even more ventilation down into that system, trying to replace it with fresh air. Just a short while later, they were able to recover 2 of those men, O'Keefe and Wilson. However, Sadly, they were both pronounced deceased on scene. As for Elway, they would have to wait even longer. This is due to the fact that even though they were forcing a lot of air down into that system, it just simply wasn't enough. The levels and toxicity were too sporadic. 1 second, you were dealing with viable oxygen, the next, you only had 5%. Further investigation by the Miami-Dade hazmat team would not only show extremely low levels of oxygen, it would also show extremely high levels of carbon monoxide and hydrogen sulfide. Now, these 3 factors on their own have the ability to end your life. A combination of the 3 is sending somebody to their most certain death. It's like going from being completely sober to being hammered beyond belief within a split second. Next, you end up passing out as your brain begins to starve of oxygen and your heart pumps out those last few final beats. You cease to exist. Now, here's a fact that makes this incident just that much more unfathomable. Most people, when hearing about it, assume it had something to do with the sewer system. But this wasn't at all the case. You see, when that box had originally been placed there many years ago, they had placed it on top of a bunch of mangroves. They didn't rip them out, they didn't try and replace any of that vegetation with viable soil. And it was for this reason all those mangroves started to decompose, which created those gases, in turn taking the lives of those men. And for months and months prior to this incident, locals in that neighborhood have been calling the city to report a backed up sewer line. They just didn't know where it was. But every time they came by, everything checked out. Turns out, it was that rotten vegetation the whole time. Dee and Higgins, the company at fault, received roughly $120,000 in fines in accordance with 3 open lawsuits for the families of the men who passed away. So what could have been done to prevent this tragedy? Well, for starters, as cruel as this might sound, Elway kind of defied a direct order. He was told not to enter that hole by his supervisor and competent person on that job site. And he did this even after being warned about the dangers that lie below. However, if he had been tied off to a vertical retrieval system, somebody up top could have easily pulled him out. In addition to this, although they did force ventilation, they never acquired any atmospheric readings. If they had lowered one of these into that hole, it would have notified them not only of the presence of lethal gases, but the fact that there was little to no oxygen. We as humans need roughly 19 to 21% to be able to survive. Well, this hole was sitting at less than 2% oxygen when the fire department initially showed up. And lastly, they did not have a rescue plan in place, nor did they have any of the proper tools to perform a rescue, even if they had a plan. And sadly, this is one of those situations where the poor decision of one individual led to the devastation of several other families in the process. When you hear the word implosion, your mind likely goes to the crushing depths of the ocean, submarines succumbing to unimaginable pressures, perhaps even the recent and tragic fate of the OceanGate's Titan. But what if I were to tell you those same catastrophic forces could occur not miles beneath the ocean, but right here on land? Terrifyingly intimate accounts of everyday operations becoming inescapable nightmares, most of which occurred in the 1980s, revealing the stark realities of working with pressure differential technologies, highlighting a crucial turning point in workplace safety. In today's video, we will be examining 2 of the most unsettling incidents from that era. So sit back and relax as we yet again step out into the abyss. So this first one takes us back to September of 1986. A few employees for General Electric's Aviation Division are in the process of conducting altitude testing on a jet engine nose cone. Now essentially the way this worked was, they would place the nose cone into a vacuum chamber similar to the one shown on screen here. The air is then continuously sucked out until they achieve an atmospheric pressure near 0.0 psi inside of the chamber. After a certain amount of time has passed, air is allowed back in. The chamber is then opened, and the cone is removed for inspection. Little did they know, their next test would result in what would arguably become one of the most brutal workplace incidents of all time. By all accounts, the test started off completely normal. Before long, they had achieved near absolute vacuum, or 0 psi, within the chamber. One of those men walked over to the porthole in order to observe the cone during the test. And he didn't know it yet, but he had just walked right into an extremely dangerous situation. To put this into perspective, at sea level, our bodies are under a constant pressure of around 14.7 pounds per square inch. Inside of that chamber, the pressure is near 0. And although this may seem like a very minute difference, you gotta remember that is pounds per square inch. meaning the porthole itself, with a diameter of 12 inches, had been subjected to inward forces of approximately 1,600 pounds repetitively for weeks on end. Imagine the biggest polar bear you have ever seen. Now imagine you've been handed a glass circle roughly 12 inches in diameter, and your job is to fight that bear off multiple times a day, day after day, week after week. That is a shitload of wear and tear. In essence, the porthole had become weakened over time. Regardless, as he stepped up to the porthole, he couldn't quite see inside due to the glare of the many overhead lights within the facility. So he placed his hand up against the glass, and as he moved his head ever so slightly forward, all of a sudden, in less than a second, the glass had failed. This tremendous change in pressure caused the individual to be pulled directly into the opening, with an immediate and devastating effect. It didn't crack or shatter, rather, it violently and explosively ruptured inward, collapsing into the chamber with a sound that would have been instantly deafening to anyone nearby. This was a complete unleashing of atmospheric fury, a sudden and catastrophic implosion. The employee, caught directly in the path of this incredible force, was instantly drawn into the opening with an overwhelming power. Their hand, head, and arm, being the leading points of impact, were instantly consumed by the chamber. The stainless steel rim of this 12-inch opening quickly became an insurpassable obstacle for the rest of the body. The relentless change in pressure continued to push, driving the man's torso and shoulders against the narrow and unforgiving edges of the opening. This wasn't a squeeze, but an instantaneous and devastating compression. His body had been forced to conform to a space it was never meant to occupy. His head, now within the vacuum, experienced an immediate and profound shift in pressure. And you gotta remember, this all happened within the span of about 2 seconds. Consciousness would have ceased almost immediately. It was swift, it was brutal, and tragically fatal. And although his co-workers immediately jumped into action to try and save him, there was just simply nothing they could do. This is OSHA report number 0317000, and the incident occurred on September 11th of 1986. General Electric, the company at fault, was cited under Section 5 of the General Duty Clause at the time. This basically states that they are responsible for providing each and every one of their employees with a workplace free from hazards that lead to serious injury and or death. Total fines incurred by General Electric at the time were $640. In today's money, that's roughly $1,900. And unfortunately, as devastating as this event was, I'd like to be able to tell you that it was an isolated occurrence. But 1986 would prove to be what seemed like a reckoning for the way that we approach workplace safety, specifically when dealing with vacuum systems. This incident, in combination with the one you're about to hear, would go on to highlight the need for immediate change, becoming a driving force in the evolution of industrial safety standards, as well as a stark reminder of the immense forces at play when dealing with this type of equipment. So this next one takes us to November of 1986, precisely 2 months after the General Electric incident we just discussed. A maintenance tech working for Avtex Fibers out of Front Royal, Virginia, had been tasked with troubleshooting a leak in an acid renewal system. And while this process is much more complicated than what I am about to tell you, what you need to know is this. The system operates under a vacuum. In other words, the leak wasn't forcing any liquids or gases out, rather, it was taking on air, hindering all the processes ahead of the evaporator. And at this point, they were well aware they had a leak. They just didn't know exactly where it was. So the maintenance tech went off, located it, and came back to report his findings. There was a crack in the evaporator roughly 2 inches long and 1/8 of an inch wide. So management discusses their options, and they came to the conclusion that they couldn't justify shutting the entire system down for what seemed like such a minor issue. To avoid the cost of shutdown times, the decision was made to make the repair while the system was still online. They would do this by cold welding a small strip of metal over the hole using an epoxy known as JB weld. This would turn out to be a critical mistake with extremely horrifying and fatal consequences. What they didn't know is that what seemed like a hairline fracture on the surface was actually a giant fissure roughly 5 feet long. With that in mind, the technician began lathering up that strip of metal with the epoxy. But as he placed it over the hole, he could still hear the leak. So he went to go apply some more pressure. But the very second he did, an entire section of the evaporator gave way, pulling the man inside. Without warning, without a single second to perceive, that barrier was completely gone. This sudden change in pressure, rushing inward, created an inescapable pull. The maintenance tech, caught directly in its path, was drawn into the rapidly collapsing space. No time to brace, no time to react. What's more is, the corrosive atmosphere inside created an extremely hazardous environment, the acidic contents of which had been violently displaced. The impact, so devastating, so forceful, consciousness would have been lost immediately. He had likely passed away within just a few seconds. Emergency services would spend the next few hours meticulously cutting apart the evaporator, trying to expand that hole in order to get him out. Avtex Fibers, the company at fault, was given a total of $900 in fines, or roughly $2,600 in today's money. So at this point, I'm sure many of you are saying, $640 doesn't seem like a lot of money after willfully placing a man into harm's way. And to clarify, these aren't the amounts they were made to pay out in wrongful death lawsuits. These are simply the amounts made to pay out to OSHA for not adhering to the safety standards implemented at the time. More so, back then, workplace safety was sort of in its Wild West phase. While they knew there was much work to be done, there were many incidents they just simply didn't come by all that often. But when they did, as you just found out, the result was more than devastating. And so in many of these cases, companies that were deemed at fault were hit with blanket clauses that covered a wide variety of incidents. Section 5 of the General Duty Clause is what allowed OSHA to give General Electric and Avtex Fibers those fines, as minute as they may seem. In the heart of a bustling industrial plant, amidst the pervasive, low hum of massive industrial freezers, imagine a room where the air itself becomes your executioner. Not by flame or by crushing force, but by an invisible killer, completely undetectable by the human eye, an odorless kleptomaniac of life itself. This was the chilling reality for many at the Gainesville, Georgia poultry plant on January 28th of 2021. What started out as a routine shift was quickly transformed into a mass casualty event by an unseen gas, becoming a harrowing reminder of the importance of routine maintenance and workplace safety. At the Foundation Food Group facility, a massive operation processing thousands of pounds of poultry a day, efficiency was paramount, and key to their high-speed production was the use of liquid nitrogen, supercooled to temperatures of around negative 320 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 196 Celsius. This seemingly inactive substance was a godsend for modern food preservation, yet its remarkable utilization concealed an equally imminent danger. When liquid nitrogen escapes the confines of its containment, when it is released into our atmosphere, it does not simply evaporate. It undergoes an extremely violent phase change, rapidly vaporizing and expanding by a factor of nearly 700 times, becoming an odorless, colorless, and extremely dangerous gas, the result of which is an atmosphere completely incapable of sustaining human life. The catalyst for this disaster was deceptively simple: a bent bubbler tube inside an immersion freezer, likely damaged during routine maintenance. This critical component was designed to precisely measure the levels of liquid nitrogen within that system, and it had become compromised. Its failure crippled not only the primary control system, but also the emergency interlock meant to stop the flow of nitrogen. It was due to this the freezer began to overfill, spilling its deadly contents onto the floor of a fully staffed processing room. However, this mechanical failure was only compounded by a far greater oversight: a complete absence of crucial safety systems. No automated alarms, at least none that were functioning correctly at the time. There were no real-time oxygen monitors, and there was no way to alert anyone that the very air they breathed was rapidly devolving into an area completely void of oxygen. On that fateful morning, as the liquid nitrogen relentlessly leaked, a silent, unseen cloud began to form, clinging to the floor, slowly rising to a deadly height of around 4 to 6 feet. A few maintenance workers, responding to the initial malfunction, entered the massive freezer. Their training had prepared them for mechanical fixes. In terms of safety, it had failed to provide them with even the most basic of rights within the workplace. That is, employers are required to ensure the clear and visible labeling of hazardous chemicals, and that their employees are entering an area that houses them. That being said, unaware of the invisible killer surrounding them, they were overcome almost immediately. But this was truly only the beginning of the nightmare. As word of their collapse spread through the factory, a desperate and tragic cascade of events began to unfold. Other employees, driven by the instinct to help, rushed directly into the void. Without hesitation, they too were consumed by the suffocating embrace of nitrogen, their lungs screaming for air. Supervisors, managers, and even a responding firefighter were among those who entered the dead zone. They were also among the individuals who did not make it out alive. In total, 6 individuals tragically lost their lives, while several others sustained serious injuries. Subsequent investigations by OSHA, as well as the United States Chemical Safety Board, laid a bare, devastating, and preventable truth. Their findings? Well, they were maddening to say the least. This tragedy was a direct result of inadequate emergency preparedness, a critical failure to install pivotal air monitoring systems, defective and/or missing alarms, in combination with a lack of training regarding the lethal dangers of liquid nitrogen. Beyond those immediate failures, further investigation revealed a blatant and willful disregard for basic safety principles. Investigators found evidence that the safety interlocks had been bypassed manually. They'd been using magnets to trick the sensor into believing nitrogen levels were within reason. This common yet dangerous practice within the industry is used to keep the system from sporadically shutting down throughout the day. In other words, the cost of production had been placed well above the cost of their own employees' lives. They'd effectively been disarming safeguards designed to prevent the very kind of overflow that occurred on that fateful day. Additionally, several of the emergency exits, along with the routes to those exits, had been obstructed. Escape routes hadn't been mapped out within the facility, and more so, emergency evacuations were never a part of their training program. By the time people realized what was happening, full-blown chaos had ensued. As the nitrogen continued to flow, the oxygen became displaced. And seeing as they had no real-time atmospheric testing or even any oxygen sensors, the alarms had to be activated manually via pull switch. To put it quite simply, these workers were not equipped, nor were they taught how to respond safely to this threat, or even be able to identify it. They could never see it, they could never smell it, they were never given a chance. As a result, OSHA levied nearly $1 million in proposed penalties across 4 companies over this incident. This is largely due to the fact Foundation Food Groups had contracted out other companies to perform tasks unrelated to production. Packers Sanitation Services took care of all the cleaning. FS Group manufactured some of their equipment, and they also assumed the responsibility of maintaining that equipment. And lastly, Messer LLC owned and leased the nitrogen tanks as well as the immersion freezers in question. Total fines incurred are as follows. FS Group, $42,325, 8 violations. Messer LLC, $74,118, 6 violations. Packer Sanitation Services, $286,720, 19 violations. And lastly, Foundation Food Group's $595,474, 26 violations, with 6 of them being willful. Meaning there were at least 6 instances in which management knew that they were breaking regulations, yet they never took any corrective action. The Gainesville poultry plant incident stands as a stark reminder that stringent safety measures, although costly, are priceless when weighed against the irreplaceable value of human life, driving home the enduring lesson that workplace safety isn't just a luxury, but an absolute necessity. Imagine for just 1 second that you become trapped and you're completely alone. All around you, the deafening roars of a factory drowning out your cries for help. And then it happens. Due to circumstances completely out of your control, you realize these are probably going to be your final moments. And no, this isn't some sort of fictional nightmare plucked out from a horror movie. This is, or was, the terrifying reality for a man named Alan Catterall, an extremely dedicated worker whose life was tragically ended due to downright negligence. This is the brutal backstory behind the Piranha Kayak Boldings incident. So back in December of 2010, the then 54-year-old Alan was a seasoned supervisor for Piranha Kayak Boldings Limited, specifically out of their factory located in Runcorn, England. and for a little over a decade, 12 years to be exact, he had been a quiet, steady, and reliable presence at this company, which was well known for making plastic kayaks. As for his family, he was a devoted father of 3, always looking forward to making the very best out of each and every holiday for his children, especially Christmas, which happened to be right around the corner. In addition to this, he was also looking forward to his daughter's upcoming wedding. But on the morning of December 23rd, just 2 days before Christmas, his hard work and dedication to that company, along with a series of critical design choices, would lead to a day no one at Piranha Moldings would ever forget. You see, at the heart of this factory stood one of these giant industrial ovens you're looking at right here. It's important to note, these weren't actually purchased from a manufacturer. As a matter of fact, Piranha had opted to design and build them on their own accord, specifically modeling them to accommodate their molding process. And well, as insignificant as this piece of information may sound, it would later become the catalyst for a very serious issue. Woven right into its design was an extremely fatal flaw. Now essentially the way this worked was, there were 2 molds for every one kayak, a top and a bottom. And well, the first part of this process involves adding a powder known as linear polyethylene to said bottom mold. The upper mold is then placed on top, where even more powder is dumped inside through a small hatch. It is at this point a button is pressed, in turn drawing the kayak into the oven. The doors then close automatically and lock from the outside. However, inside of the oven, there was no way to manually override this process, no internal alarm system to signal any sort of distress, and things only continue to get worse. From the control panel, there wasn't a clear line of sight into the oven, meaning, theoretically, an operator could activate this entire process without ever truly knowing if the oven had been cleared out. And so it is. Shortly before 9 a.m. on that fateful morning, the oven popped out an error code, taking it out of service. This was a common occurrence, as quite often you had to get in there and clean up blobs of plastic that had dripped out of the molds. Regardless, the operator, a man by the name of Mark, goes up to Alan and he's like, "Look, I gotta use the bathroom, I've got a mold out here, it's ready to go, I'm in a rush, is there any way that you can clean this for me before I get back?" With that, Alan grabs a crowbar, walks on into the oven, and starts scraping up all these chunks of plastic. Now just a short while later, Mark finishes up using the bathroom. He then walks back over to the control panel, and for one reason or another, that code had been cleared out. All leading up to the critical moment he activated the oven while Alan was still inside performing maintenance. The very second that button was pressed, the kayak drew itself into the oven, with the doors closing and locking directly behind it. Alan was now officially sealed inside of this thing, completely trapped, the drones and whirs of the production floor drowning out his cries for help. It was in that very moment Alan likely realized he was going to remain inside of this thing for at least 10 minutes. Just 3 minutes later, that oven has reached temperatures of well over 500 degrees. It wasn't until smoke began billowing out of the top of it that people realized something was wrong. The process then came to a complete halt, and when they opened those doors, the discovery they made was absolutely horrifying. Alan had unfortunately spent his last few moments beating and prying on that door with the crowbar in a desperate attempt to escape. But it was of no use. The doors were simply too thick, and the bar was too wide to be able to jam in between them and gain any sort of leverage. But that's not even where this ends, because this story becomes so much worse when you realize the individual who pressed that button was due to marry Alan's daughter in the near future. Yes, Mark was Alan's future son-in-law. The terrifying discovery of Alan's death launched an immediate joint investigation between the police and the health and safety executives. What they began to uncover wasn't just a single isolated error. It was a devastating series of utter negligence. As a matter of fact, the courts would go on to hear numerous accounts of previous near misses. Workers had apparently been inside these ovens when the doors began closing on them as well. However, luckily, they were able to make it out in time. More so, there was a palpable growing fear among the employees of this exact same scenario becoming a reality. In other words, it wasn't just some unforeseeable incident. It was a disaster begging to happen. And sadly, all of their concerns seemed to fall on deaf ears. In addition to this, they hadn't conducted a proper risk assessment on the procedures of entering or cleaning the oven. Neither of these two tasks had been incorporated into their training program. As for the oven itself, it was designed by the company's own technical director, Peter Makareth. He had personally overseen its design without incorporating fundamental safety features. There was no escape hatch, no ability to access the locking mechanism internally, as well as the missing alarm. Piranha Moldings, the company at fault, was found guilty of corporate manslaughter. They were made to pay roughly $200,000 in fines. As for Peter McArath, he received a 9-month suspended prison sentence. This essentially means that if he stayed out of trouble over the course of those 9 months, which he did, he would end up staying out of prison. And while Alan's family, understandably, expressed a slight bit of gratitude over this verdict, it will never truly erase the profound and lasting pain of their loss. Since that day, an escape hatch was made to be placed on each and every one of those ovens. The story of Alan Catterall is one of the many dark and mysterious incidents we will be covering on this channel. So whether you are new here or you've been around since before I took a year off, know that I am back and I am committed to bringing you even more compelling stories in the future. Feel like you learned something new or you just simply enjoy this type of content, consider leaving a like, maybe subscribing, as we have several other videos in the making. 2 to 3 inches of water may seem relatively harmless. However, under the right circumstances, that may be all it takes to end your life. This is the true story of how a young and promising individual lost his life, all in an effort to prove himself to the company. Back in November of 2017, the then 22-year-old Brett Morrow had been working for a relatively small construction crew for a large firm out of Indiana. They were performing an operation in Streamwood, Illinois. And during this project, they had been tasked with repairing a 24-inch sewer line by way of cured-in-place piping, or CIPP, which, for those of you who don't know, is basically a cloth-like sleeve that is forced through a pipe by way of air or, in some cases, water. Now, after that sleeve has made its way through the pipe, a chemical within that material, called styrene, will then begin to harden up, effectively becoming the new inside wall of that pipe. Now, I'm not going to get into all the benefits of cured-in-place piping, but what you need to know is this. It is way more cost-effective to repair a pipe under a roadway or in an intersection by using this method, rather than shutting traffic down, digging up the asphalt, busting up the pipe, and then having to put it all back. It is basically your dream come true cure-all for many situations, and it is not only efficient, but it is cost-effective as well. Regardless, the pipe they're going to be relining sat about 20 feet below the surface and about 30 feet away from the manhole they were going to be setting up in. So they grabbed the machine and they set it up just outside of the manhole. They began feeding down that liner in order to start the process. Little did they know, within just a few hours, it would all end in tragedy. As this material is making its way from one manhole to another, the process comes to a complete stop as it has become snagged on something roughly 30 feet away. Well, now at this point, they need to act rather quickly, because if they don't, that material is going to harden up in the position that it is in, causing a major blockage, completely foregoing the cost benefit of them doing this in the first place. They may as well have just dug on down to the pipe and cut it out, because that's what they're going to have to do, if they do not deal with it in a timely fashion. So Brett, young, wide-eyed, and eager to prove himself to this company, climbs the 20 feet down into this manhole, cuts the liner away from the machine, and begins making his way towards that blockage to try and figure out what's going on. Well, before too long, he has discovered everything has become one big giant jumbled up mess within this pipe. So he just starts beating on it and cutting at it with a small utility knife, trying to clear it out so they can bring another liner and give it another go. But it was no use. It just seemed like no matter how much he cut and peeled back, he was making very little headway. Unbeknownst to Brett, not only did he have this extremely thick wall of plastic forming in front of his face, but seeing as he had been using his feet to push and gain leverage on the material behind him, that too began to rip up from the walls of the actual pipe, forming yet another blockage directly behind him, all the while becoming more and more solidified the longer he stays inside, effectively sealing him completely off inside of this pocket. Now, what is not made clear by any of the reporting about this incident is whether or not another individual had been down there in the manhole watching this all go down as it was happening. What is clear is that when shit finally hit the fan, they were still able to get a visual field of his boots, and he was still communicating with them at that time, meaning that he was fully conscious and aware of just how dire this situation was. And unfortunately, that lining had solidified so quickly, they just simply didn't have any of the tools necessary to get in there and cut it out. Brett cannot burst through to the other side of that blockage. He cannot turn around to try and cut out what's behind him. He is now completely trapped inside of this pocket with no way of getting out. It was at this point a call to emergency services was made, and when they finally showed up, they would spend the next 4 hours attempting to cut out this material, relentlessly climbing back in, cutting it, pulling it out, taking it out of the manhole, going back in, cutting more out, rinse and repeat. It was a very long and grueling process. Well, at some point during this rescue op, their worst fears were realized, as Brett had not only stopped moving, but he had become completely unresponsive. And unfortunately, by the time they were able to cut him out, it was far too late. He had long since passed away. Here's what went down. The liner itself had gotten snagged on not just a crack, but a completely broke off section of the pipe that had hung down, forming a jagged triangle shape. This, in turn, caused the liner to completely stop moving and begin bunching up. As for Brett, that compound we had spoken of earlier, styrene, had begun pooling up and evaporating inside of this little pocket. It was due to this, along with a lack of oxygen, that Brett ended up passing out. His face then slumped down into a 3-inch puddle, where sadly, he ended up drowning in that pipe. Benchmark Construction, the company at fault, would pay out roughly $55,000 in fines over the incident, in accordance with a $3 million wrongful death lawsuit paid out to the family of Brett Morrow. They would use a sizable portion of that money to educate new tradesmen on the dangers of styrene, as well as this process in general. So just what could have been done to prevent this tragedy? Which, by the way, before I go on, why should you as a viewer listen to anything I have to say? That is a completely valid question, and here's why I feel like I'm a little more qualified than your average creator when it comes to discussing topics like this. I not only have my competent persons in trenching and excavation, I also have my competent persons in confined spaces. This is what I do, this is my forte. Meaning, if an incident were to occur on a job site in either of those situations, and it was proven negligence led to that incident, it is very likely I will be among the individuals charged legally over that incident. That being said, what could have been done to prevent this tragedy? Well, for starters, they didn't have any sort of rescue plan in place or any of the proper tools to perform a rescue, even if they had a plan, which leads us right into number 2. Brett was not tied off to a retrieval system of any kind, which is what you're looking at on screen here. This is an actual photo from the night they attempted to rescue Brett. However, this specific piece of equipment did not belong to the company, rather the fire department. And if Brett had been hooked off to one of these with a harness, somebody up top could have started cranking down on that handle to pull him out of the pipe. 3, you must be able to maintain either verbal or visual contact with the individual that is in that pipe. 4, they never did any atmospheric readings of either the manhole or the pipe itself. If they had done so, or if Brett was wearing one of these, it would have notified him the very second oxygen levels started dropping. An atmospheric reader, like the one shown on screen here, should have been lowered down and taken readings in the lower third, the middle third, and the upper third of that confined space, or the manhole. Because as stated in my previous video, different gases settle at different depths. For instance, styrene is heavier than air, therefore it is going to accumulate in the lower third of that confined space. However, something such as methane, which is lighter than air, also found in sewer systems quite commonly, will be sitting more between the upper and middle portion of that confined space. Therefore, they never thought to apply ventilation to the area in question. None of that was done until the fire department showed up and began the process of trying to rescue Brett. Even though the entire rescue operation for the story you're about to hear only took about 10 minutes, the men involved in this incident never stood a chance. This is a story about how 2 men lost their lives over a roll of duct tape. It is around 1 a.m. at the Valero oil refinery, and 3 men are performing maintenance on a reactor vessel. Now at this point, it had already been shut down for a few days, and the crew was under a lot of pressure to get the system back up and running. Well, the final task involved in this operation was to connect one last piece of pipe on top of the vessel. This would allow liquid nitrogen to enter that reactor. However, as they are getting ready to do this, getting their tools ready, one of the workers sees a roll of duct tape that has fallen into the reactor. So at this point, that same worker walked off to grab a roll of electric wire. He came on back, he cut him about an 8-foot strip, and then made a hook on the end of it. He then sits down on top of the reactor right at the opening, with his feet dangling down inside. And he doesn't know it yet, but he has just made a grave mistake. A mistake that will unfortunately have fatal consequences. After just a few unsuccessful attempts, that wire dropped out of his hands as he slumped over, falling face first into the reactor. Now at this point, his supervisor ran over to the hole and began to try and elicit a response from him, but there was nothing. So he runs away from the hole to grab a ladder that's about 20 feet away. He then dropped it into the bottom of that hole and began to make his way down in an attempt to pull him out of the reactor. But as soon as his feet hit the ground, he too went down. So now we have 2 out of the 3 workers which are completely out of the game. There is 1 more up top, and he has just a few seconds to make the right decision. And luckily, he would grab his radio and call in an emergency. Within a matter of seconds, the alarms sound off at the refinery. They have company responders that come rushing to the scene to try and figure out what's going on. So before they can actually enter this reactor, there is something critical they have to do. They must test the atmosphere or the oxygen levels within the reactor. So they drop their device down and very quickly discover that there is less than 1% oxygen. A normal atmosphere is in the one that you and I are breathing in right now is roughly 19 to 21%. Anything over or anything under can be critical to our health. So now with this information they have, one of those responders puts on a closed air breathing system in order to jump down in that hole in an attempt to rescue the men. Unfortunately, they were both pronounced deceased on scene. Here's what went down. When this system is in use, nitrogen is used to purge the reactor. In other words, nitrogen is forced into this tank in order to displace all of the oxygen. And while yes, there is a way to stop this while they perform maintenance on that vessel, the valve that is used to do so was not shut completely off. Therefore, over the last few days, nitrogen had been allowed to seep into this tank, slowly building up to higher and higher levels, till eventually there was almost no oxygen inside that tank. And while yes, nitrogen does comprise a significant portion of the air that we breathe in, roughly 78%, you still need 19 to 21% oxygen in order for that environment to be viable for life. The atmospheric makeup of this tank at that time was sitting at 99% nitrogen and 1% oxygen. So these men had unfortunately gone through all stages of nitrogen narcosis extremely fast. Within just a few seconds, they went from feeling completely normal to drunk beyond belief to passed out. In addition to this, it is very likely they had both passed away before the rescue team could even make it to the tank. And here's something that makes this story just a little bit more crazy. The pipe that was allowing the nitrogen to build up inside of this reactor was not even connected to the reactor at the time. This was the one that they were about to connect. There was about a 4-foot gap, meaning that nitrogen had flowed out of the pipe through the air, finding its way into the tank because it is that much more heavy than air. So what could have been done to prevent this death? Well, one thing that we use in a lot of these situations is a sniffer or atmospheric tester. Now this tank, or reactor rather, is what is known across the industry as a confined space. And I'm going to try and explain this to you in terms that OSHA does not use, therefore making it not complicated. This can be any small enclosed area that has a limited access point for entry and exit that is large enough for somebody to fit inside of, but is not meant for a worker to stay in there for extended periods of time. In a lot of instances, to enter confined spaces, you must have 1, proper ventilation set up. 2, you must check the atmospheric readings of the environment you are going to in the lower third, the middle third, and the top third, because different lethal gases settle at different heights. And if they had had one of those even near that hole, it probably would have been going off before even being placed inside that tank, meaning they would have been alerted to this danger prior to even going up close to the opening. Lastly, and as cruel as this might sound to a lot of you out there, if somebody you know goes down in a confined space, the worst thing that you can possibly do is to put yourself in that situation trying to be the hero. You do not know what is down there, and you do not know what is going on. And trust me when I say this, you cannot survive in 1% oxygen. I mean, heck, there was an incident in Key Largo just a few years back where not only did one person go down to check on an initial unresponsive coworker, but another entered that confined space as well, and all 3 men ended up losing their lives. That being said, stay safe, and we will see you on the next one.